Is it live?
Yes.
Good. All right. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're on chapter number 19, the final and last chapter of this great book. And the book ends quite beautifully. And the book is still very relevant today. And I will try to do justice to this last chapter. Again, to me, the most interesting and beneficial part of the book is the last part. This is when he is obviously an adult, when he is not just telling his backstory, but we are seeing the Malcolm X that we know of. Obviously, the backstory is very important, but this is very, very relevant. And so what I will do is simply list some of the points that he mentions at the end in this final chapter. Then next week, inshallah, we will discuss. It'll be just fully a discussion of what we get from the book. Part of that discussion may take place today, just because technically speaking, we will be finished with the last chapter of the book, chapter number 19. And the chapter opens up with us seeing a more refined, smarter Malcolm X with new insight. Remember, he has made the pilgrimage. He has made, I guess you could say, some radical changes, which is amazing too. And he talks about this in this chapter. And whatever he believes in it with passion. This is what he says at the very last pages of the book. And I think that's something for us to benefit from. Whatever we believe in, whether it be religious or secular, we believe in it and be determined and have this passion and zeal. And inshallah, if you do that, you can fulfill some of your dreams. Also, he mentioned that he had just finished an 18-week, which is quite long, international, this is 1965, in the 60s, right? Tour. So he has great insight to the world, the global condition. And he's someone who loves to read, and it's very well read, but now he was very well traveled in America, but now in his last few years, last couple of years, he is now getting some international travel. And so it's even broadening his horizon even more. And he begins the chapter by telling or saying that the African American or the American Negro need to not only see himself or his condition as a domestic problem, but rather it is a global problem. And he wanted to bring charges against America to the UN. And this was very serious. And there was actually some fear, and wanted to push this agenda to the world. And he traveled to Africa and met some heads of states in order to push this agenda. But just like in the 60s, I mean, just like now, even in the 60s, there was a lot of politics, and also going against the big powers would mean that you suffer consequences. So some of the African countries didn't follow suit. And it'd be very interesting. I mean, we can speculate now what would have happened if, Malcolm X was able to push this further up the road. But anyway, he opens this. That's one of his points, that the African American should see themselves in. Should present this as a global problem, just not a domestic problem. And it's interesting because even today, several decades later, there is a huge problem. I mean, we have this Black Lives Matter because African Americans are really, and my humble opinion, in trouble in terms of progress. And there's still all those things that he talked about in the 60s still exist here. And they're still on the very bottom, despite being here for literally centuries. So something is wrong. Something is very wrong. And I'll mention something. I'm smiling because I'm thinking of a conversation that I had very recently with Kenneth, Brother Kenneth. It was a brother who was an immigrant who was driving us. And I said, yeah, alhamdulillah, I mentioned that his people, they reside in a certain part of America, or people from his nationality, and they're doing very well. And he mentioned, like, of course they're doing very well. All immigrants do very well. This is the land of opportunities. And some of our countries, and I guess somewhat he was saying, they suck, they're terrible. But you Americans, he didn't say you, I guess, maybe he didn't know where I was from, nor Kenneth. You just take it for granted. So I think he does make a point, and you don't take advantage of your opportunities. But it's very amazing. This is just 2 days ago. But I think a lot of people think like that. Even African Americans themselves, white, black, and there's some truth to it. But he didn't single out African Americans in general. But he was like, you guys, or Americans in general, you're not making the progress that you should make, though you have all of these opportunities. And I can come here, or my people can come here and be successful. Something is wrong. So a lot of people are pointing out the wrong, but I think it is a little bit complex of what's the problem. And this was Malcolm X's specialty, meaning that it was much easier then too, even though back then you did have rules that really weren't enforced, but to specify, to make clear the problem was easier then. And to a certain extent, there was a lot more progress been made then than now. As a matter of fact, you would say, you could make a point that the progress of African American is somewhat stagnant or even have regressed. But I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I think this is an important point of the book. And he is emphasizing this in the beginning, that this is a global problem, and that everyone should be on board. And he somewhat mentioned all non-whites should be on board. And this makes another point, even though obviously he intends whites too, but he's saying that all non-whites for sure, because if it's not them today, it's going to be someday. They're going to be the boogeyman. Like now we know that there are problems in the recent past with persecution of Latinos and of Jews. I mean, in just the last few years, and now Asians. So, and other people as well, and other groups as well. And it's amazing to see how relevant this book is today, because I think you can take a lot of gems and a lot of insight from this book. And it's just, again, if he lived a little longer, we probably could have benefited a little bit more, but everything happens for a reason. And with this point too, I'm moving a little slow and I apologize, but this is something I want to mention, because he mentions that oppression he's against anywhere, injustice anywhere. He makes it very clear it's not about the black man or the Negro. And he mentions that oppression anywhere is something that he hates, or injustice anywhere is something that he hates. And so he spells out, and I think for sure in the past, civil rights was viewed as universal. However, I think now it's somewhat not the case. And what I mean by that, and I've had this conversation with many African Americans, now when you hear someone saying that they are oppressed, it seems to be only about them, and Muslims included. I mean, I've had conversation again with many Muslims about this when it's, and deals with, this reminds me of Malcolm X's statement here in this chapter when he talks to the Jewish man, and he mentions very clearly some hypocrisy. So even he opens up, and I think even the hypocrisy, just not at Jews, but it's a lot of people. Like, for example, I hear some people, and it's now what I'm about to say is somewhat controversial. So I want to brace you a little bit. But when I hear people talk about their problem, it's as if they're saying our problems are the most important problems and everything else is minor. So, for example, you hear people talking about the problem in Kashmir, and they won't mention any other problems. And I'm serious. And it's as if only Kashmir exists. You have people who talk about Palestine. Again, this is very sensitive, but I've heard people who say that this is the only thing the Muslim community should focus on right now. Everything else should be dropped. I mean, this is the Holy Land. And so that's not the mentality. And you hear also with, for example, this is Pride Month, and you hear people saying, hey, we are oppressed, we have these issues, and this is the only thing that you should focus on. The Asian hate, the same thing. And I'm sure you see people like that. They only talk about the oppression. It's real oppression, whether it's in China, Bangladesh with the Rohingyas. It's oppression. And Malcolm X stated it very beautifully that oppression anywhere is an issue for him. And I think we have somewhat lost that now, and we only focus on our issues. And I think we have been called out, and we can talk about that later, even by politicians. I've heard stories where they say, it seems like the only thing that concerns you is or are your issues, the issue that deals with your community. And this is not right if we call ourselves Muslims, obviously, and it's not right even if we call ourselves part of humanity, that we're all brothers and sisters. So I think this was something that was very interesting. The next point, and I know I'm moving very slow, he mentions, the next point, he talks about the accusation that he is violent. And he's for violence. And to this day, many people have this misconception, even though the book opens up, at least my edition of the book, with his daughter defending this image of Malcolm X. And he states it very clearly at the end, I am not for violence. I'm not a person who's going out and saying we need to kill this, but I'm for defense. And he would say somewhat an eye for eye. And he mentions very, very beautifully, you guys can refer to it if you want to, and even read the passages where he talks about, hey, even if the tables were switched, and even if there was African Americans, and he said Negroes causing problems for white people, then they have every right to defend themselves from them. And if then he mentions like the Jews and the Irish and other people, their right to defend their lands, and this is fine. So he makes a very passionate argument that he is not a violent person, but he's a person that is not a pacifist, and he believes that gets you nowhere, and that's a non-starter because it doesn't solve problems. So he makes that very clear. And obviously, Dr. Martin Luther King at that time was pushing that. So, and he was saying that African Americans really shouldn't buy into this, and people who are oppressed in general shouldn't buy into that. And actually, this is what's in the Torah, what's in the Old Testament, and even in Islam. It's okay to respond and to defend and all these things. However, in certain scenarios, Allah does says, وَإِن تَعْفُوا أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى, to forgive, to overlook is closer to taqwa. This was mentioning in marital situations, but sometimes, I guess you could say, an overarching principle would be, yes, to overlook if possible. If it doesn't make the situation worse, is to forgive and to overlook and to pardon. But defending yourself is not considered violent. And he makes that, and that's what he's saying. I'm not saying go out and attack and do this and take your rights by violence. I'm just saying that we should defend ourselves. And there was an issue that had happened a couple times, but one in which there was a Muslim who was killed, and the CIA, FBI, and all of them were watching the Muslims how they were going to respond, because and in this case he was saying, and eventually they didn't do anything because Elijah Muhammad didn't give the order, but and Malcolm X was a little embarrassed, but he later on said that basically this was a secular issue, not a religious issue. But in that scenario, I'm only mentioning this because he would have felt that, hey, they shot 7 Muslims and killed 1. Then if we attacked that police officer, and they were making surveillance on that police officer, he would have deemed that as not violent. But anyway, I'm just making that point even maybe a little clearer. So then he mentions another point. I'm just going to mention maybe 2 or 3 points, then we'll open the floor for questions. Another point that I thought was very interesting, and I thought that this book was very relevant, and I'm sure, I hope everyone read this last chapter. He mentions the decline of Christianity. And even he mentioned very clearly that some people mentioned that this in 1960s is post-Christian era, and how people are leaving Christianity, and how Christianity has failed people, and how Christianity, the institution, has been used to promote racism and slavery, and has been misused. And he mentions just the opposite about Islam. So it's very interesting. I mean, all these non-Muslims, I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not more, who have read this book. And remember, even he was a global figure, so probably well over 1 million people, non-Muslims I mentioned, have read this book. And so he talks mentions a very strong point about the decline of Christianity and the lack of really the ability of this institution to deal with oppression, to deal with injustice, and to deal with racism. And he mentions, he over and over again, he's mentioning at this last chapter, racism is a sickness that is taking over America. Even he mentions that he has, when he's overseas, and even talking to ambassadors and whites who are there, he has a conversation with them, and they're saying, I don't even have these racial thoughts. I don't even see color. I see language differences more than color. But when I go back to America, these are the white American, then I get bombarded with this, which was very interesting. That this system in the history of America is something that it breeds you, is bred into people, it seems like, and that is always front and center. I thought that was very interesting. And he mentioned while he was overseas that he saw this agent, and I mentioned this story the last time I spoke, who kept following him, and it really annoyed him. So he went over and gave him a piece of his mind. And the agent seemed to not know much about him, at least according to Malcolm X's account. And he mentioned some of his old belief. This is also very beautiful. In the end of the chapter, he talks over and over again about his radical change, and about that there are good whites, and that he does work, even his new organization, it's Christians, non-Muslims and Buddhists, and even atheists. And even he mentions even Uncle Tom's are his friends now. So he's totally different. And he even mentions a lot of regret preaching, this heresy about Islamic heresy. And he regretted that he pushed some good intentioned whites away. And he mentioned one girl in particular who seemed to be sincere, and he used this word sincerity a lot. She wanted to help, and he basically said, nothing you can do. So at the end, there was a radical change. And this is amazing. And again, and he believed in this new message with passion. However, he still seemed to struggle. It seems like, to me at least. And for example, and this is very beautiful as well, a point that he mentioned, that the new organization, he welcomed whites and non-blacks to be a part of, but non-members, because he figured that if they are members, they may have too much influence, or it may take a while for the African Americans to really galvanize. And basically that's the point he was saying, that, and he used the word solidarity. He said, how can we have black-white solidarity? We don't have black solidarity. I know some of that may be ideal and sky in the pie, but to a greatest extent, there's a lot of truth to that, what he was saying. But again, I do think he still struggled a little bit, because he went from one extreme to another. But even like Embrace, we say reverts led by reverts. Everyone is invited and they can give their share, but to a certain extent, he was saying that in order to work on your own problems, you should welcome all, but you have to really, and you can hear, but I guess the shot callers should be from that group, ethnicity, or what have you. In this case, African Americans. But that's something we can talk about later, because there are some pros and cons to that. And he mentioned that he hates being called anti-Semitic, and he said it burns him up. So he was called violent, and he said, "I'm not a violent person," and that he passionately rebutted that. Likewise, he was saying, the truth is the truth. And he mentioned, for example, general broad brush image of Jews. So he mentioned to this person who's an agent, and I think you are a Jew with an anglicized name. And it kind of riled him up, and he realized that he was right. And the Jew said, "How did you know this Jewish agent?" And he said, I have enough experience. And he went through a few things. And then he mentioned, he said, "I have nothing against the Jews, but one thing, I hold nothing against them, except that they claim to be the friends of the black man." And it's this hypocrisy in it, because the more that the black man is focused on, the less racial attention is focused on them. But he did say, I do understand that they were the ones who financed a lot of the civil rights movement, that they're the first who stood up. And so he says there are good things, but does seem to be some sincerity, because you guys have power and authority, and you own a lot of the property that's in the black neighborhood, and you own a lot of the media and the real estate and what have you. So you could do much more and twist. You have leverage, and it's not being led. And then he mentioned that when it comes to white flight, that the Jews are the first to leave. And then he mentioned that but when they leave and try to enter into other neighborhoods, that they struggle. So this is interesting. Obviously, this is a general, broad, stereotypical picture, and I'm sure he met people that it did. And I've met people, and everyone met people who fulfilled this. But again, I've met black people who fulfilled black stereotype, white people who fulfilled that. But it's interesting. He spoke, and he was very brave to say what he saw, and that was his reality. And one other thing you see throughout this chapter, objectivity. He mentioned very, very, very firmly that you cannot just say, because this person also said, you're anti-American, you're racist. And he said, hey, obviously they didn't do a good job of teaching you. I'm a new person. I don't think like that anymore. And he talks about this objectivity over and over again, that you have to respect my opinion and not just say, this is the only thing that is acceptable. This is the only way that could be the case. I am an objective person, open-minded. And he mentions this word open-minded, excuse me, over and over again. And I think that's powerful. And I think also we should, and as a convert, I think I was open-minded, and many are, because growing up, especially in the South, I mean, everything else you're not supposed to even look at. And even to today, you know, if you don't do certain things that are the norm, even in America, you are looked at as not just odd, but sometimes un-American. You don't celebrate Christmas. You don't do this. You don't do that. If you, even within the Muslim community, or you're looked at as odd or even backwards. You may be accepted, or should I say tolerated, but it's interesting. He makes this point as well. He was a thinker, and I think he was a great thinker, and he spoke his mind. The last point I want to make, and again, it's a lot more that we can cover, but these were the major points. He also mentioned before the last point, he talks about this Goldwater versus Johnson. And so it was very interesting. And I think it was a beautiful point that you have the fox and the wolf. So, and I think you still have the fox and the wolf. He was mentioning that Democrats and Republicans, the wolf will, you know, he's a wolf. And and there's benefits in that. The fox is sly, and he's talking about the Democrat, and they will only let you go so far, but they intend to devour you as well. And there's benefits and both, and pros and cons in both approaches. To a certain extent, I think that's still true today. I mean, that's a little rough. I wouldn't describe it that in those terms, but I think both have their agendas, and you have to fit into their agenda. One may seem that they're more open than the other, but I think he makes an accurate description. So the last point, he mentioned, and before the very last point, meaning before he makes his last point, he introduces this, that I never thought that I will live to be an old man, because I'm very passionate in my views and because of the history of my relatives, meaning his father and uncles, and I speak my mind, and that's not a recipe for living a long life. And he mentioned that I don't even expect to live for the next day. I feel that I am already dead. And he mentions, or he spends several sentences saying that, and he was very accurate. He even says, I don't think I will see the finished book and the finished version of this book. It's kind of hard to listen to him saying that, forecast. And then he even forecasts. So this really crystal clear that he understood. And he mentions that I know I have a hit on me. And he did know that. And this proved that he wasn't really violent, because it's almost emotional. He tells the people in these gatherings, and the gatherings became more open to Muslims and non-Muslims, to everybody, that don't shake them down. He could have perhaps extended his life, and only Allah knows best, by having more security, but he didn't want that security. He didn't want people to see them as gunned and violent and what have you. Violent is not the word, but maybe people say militant. It's very almost painful to see that. But he mentions, I think I'm dead. And he said, and I will die a violent death, meaning that not only am I a dead man, that I probably will be killed either by, and he first thought that it'd be by the Nation of Islam, or even a racist white person may kill me, or racist whoever. He mentioned that explicitly. And then he said, then he says, watch and see. I think those were his exact words, if I'm not mistaken. Watch and see. When I die, telling the reader, and he thinks it's like imminent, they're going to use my death and still dog me out and talk bad about me. So you see, in this last chapter, he's doing a lot of defending, trying to set the record straight who he is. This is his story. So he said, and it was very true. He said, watch and see, and it was true that they will, especially when he's dead and he can't defend himself, will use his death to further promote that he is a bad guy, he's violent, he's this, and sure enough, this happened. I mean, I guess he wasn't a genius to figure that out, but this guy was violent and he died a violent death. This guy was this, and you see, and so he was right. And he mentions this at the very end of his book, Watch and See. And so, which is powerful too, because he's like a counter, preempt that this is not me. Know who I am, know what Islam is. And he mentions that he made a lot of mistakes. He ends with this: I made a lot of mistakes, so the mistakes are mine. And whatever is right in my life and in this book is all praises due to Allah. Very, very beautiful the way of ending. And also he mentions right before ending that he regret, and this is a point for us, not being more educated. And if he had a chance, he said it's amazing, 8th grade education, but he was the most sought after speaker, or the second most sought after speaker in the college circuit. So imagine if he did become a lawyer. He mentions that, I wish I became a lawyer, because he loved debating and loved rhetoric and loved logic. So it was very interesting. And he said also, my path was somewhat inevitable. Me ending up in jail is basically, he said, you could have foreseen that. It's very beautiful. I mean, my circumstances, the life I live, the only logical conclusion is I would end up in jail. And he said, in defending his bad beliefs in the past, that you can see why I responded positively to the message that the white man is the devil and the racism. I mean, his family members were killed. He was not a lawyer. He was, because of, racism. He saw firsthand, and he traveled even when he was young, how he was limited. And that is so painful what he saw. And it really blackened his heart. No pun intended, but it really made him blind. And he mentioned that too, anger can blind you. And it's just so beautiful how he mentioned why he is a new person and how Islam is great. And he's learning, he started learning Arabic, and he loves language. And he's I think a great inspiration today. And still, even to this day, many people read the book and accept Islam, white, black, American, non-American. And may Allah grant him success in the hereafter, and may Allah allow us and forgive him of his shortcomings, and may Allah allow us to take the good from his life and to benefit from it. Jazakumullahu khairan. With that, let me stop the